introduce our speaker for the night for this evening. Greg Ketchen is a retired U.S. Coast Guard captain living in Osterville. He is a volunteer at the Coast Guard Heritage Museum located here in Barnstable Village in the old Customs House, formerly the Treasure Museum, and he currently serves as its president. Before moving to the Cape 10 years ago, Captain Greg's career included heading operations at the New England Aquarium, providing support to Massachusetts commercial ports as a development consultant, and filling a wide variety of Coast Guard jobs. These included performing duties as the head of the service's search and rescue program policies, completing an assignment as deputy commander and chief oceanographer for the International Ice Patrol, serving on the faculty of the Coast Guard Academy, and commanding Group Boston and a NATO station in Italy. He has completed graduate studies in both physical oceanography and business administration. Tonight's program is sponsored by Peter and Susan Alefarakis and Richard and Lisa Oliver, and I thank them very much. Please welcome Captain Greg Ketchen.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. Thank you, Anne, for that introduction. Tonight, hopefully, we can get away from the pandemic and politics and some of the other disasters and get something later on your docket. That's shipwrecks. I say that sort of facetiously. Shipwrecks are a very serious part of a mariner's life. It is something that's part of Cape Cod history too, and I am very interested in that. Obviously, we tell the story of Cape Cod and the Coast Guard at the Coast Guard Heritage Museum. But tonight, I have to have full disclosure here. I am a wash ashore, although I used to spend my summers largely down here in the Cape, and my ancestors were wandering the Cape 400 years ago, actually, to the year on Cape Cod. But I only came to the Cape, as Ann mentioned, a decade ago. So having said that, let me see if I can get to the presentation. This is the hard part of the evening, is switching. And I should be there at this point. Tonight's talk is about shipwrecks on Cape Cod, but I'm going to take a different approach to it. My introduction to shipwrecks was the first step is to get the clicker to work. Hold on 1 second, I'll try it this way. Should I be? I'll be right there. This is a technological glitch here. Any ideas, Greg? No. You'll have to reshare.
Stop share and then share. Yeah.
We're still here. Just hold on 1 second. It's the technology of advancing the screen. I hate to be stuck on the screen all night, although it's an interesting photo taken. Frankly, this particular photograph shows a shipwreck, but it's a shipwreck off of Oregon. It's just a particularly dramatic one. Soon we will be able to advance to something a little bit more insightful. Believe it or not, we tested this several times before we started this evening. My early years on the Cape were spent mostly out in Brewster on the sand flats, wandering out. I developed a love of oceanography then and marine science, and that led to both undergraduate and graduate work in oceanography and marine science, to the point where that was very much a part of my career. The love of the ocean was, I think we have it now, maybe. Almost there. The love of the ocean led to my applying to the Coast Guard Academy and going there out of high school. I am a Massachusetts resident, but central Massachusetts, in a small town called Belchertown. But now living on a Cape and enjoying that. Now, this was my first experience with a shipwreck, frankly, is what's shown in the picture here. For those of you that have been on the Cape for a few decades, should recognize this shipwreck. I use that term loosely because it wasn't a shipwreck right there. It was moved there back during World War II. It's called the Longstreet. Longstreet was a 341-foot Liberty ship used during the first year of World War II, and then had a grounding off of New Jersey and essentially declared a total loss and was moved to Cape Cod ultimately to be used as target practice. So it's better known to us in the Cape as the target ship off of Eastham. And up until the early 90s, it was visible still, but then storms dragged it into a little deeper water, and you can only see it during extremely low tides. But that said, it's an interesting part of the Cape, and it is one of many shipwrecks I'll be getting to here in a second. We have, as I said, if you have lived on a Cape for more than a decade and you like shipwrecks, which hopefully you do with tonight's lecture, you probably have heard or maybe met or read a book by Bill Quinn. Bill was the quintessential Cape Cod shipwreck expert. In 2014, we lost Bill at the age of 87, or as Bill would probably prefer to be said, he crossed over the bar, to paraphrase Tennyson, a more nautical term to passing away. Bill was an author, a photographer, historian, wrote the book, if you will, or should I say books on shipwrecks, many books on shipwrecks, including one called Shipwrecks of Cape Cod, around Cape Cod. I will say I am not Bill Quinn. My perspective is going to be a little bit different, perspective of a Coast Guard officer, where I spent my career, the majority of my career in search and rescue and specializing in research, oceanography, and operations in the Coast Guard. So Bill, let me see if we can advance this now, get right here. Bill wrote this book, Shipwrecks Around Cape Cod, and was, this is one of his photographs from the, as it turns out, the Argo Merchant. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Bill is actually not in this photograph, he's behind a camera, taking pictures of the Argo Merchant. People ask me in my Coast Guard career if there were highs and lows, and as you might suspect, there were both highs and lows, mostly highs, but some of the lows were, well, one specifically I remember very clearly was in 1994 in Gloucester. I had command of what's called Group Gloucester, Coast Guard Command, whose operating area includes up to the New Hampshire border, out to the Connecticut, or out to New York border, and down to just south of Plymouth. A comparable command is here in Woods Hole called Group, or now Sector Woods Hole. Part of my command included Gloucester, and in 1994, we had an EPIRB signal that came in. EPIRBs are an acronym for Emergency Position Indicating Radio Beacon. And they are designed to go off either manually if someone presses a button to say that I've got an emergency going on here, or if a ship sinks, and often these are mounted in the bridge of the ship, and if it encounters salt water, it'll go off. We received a signal from an EPIRB in 5 September 1994, a storm. It was located, the EPIRB gave a position. The vessel was located out on Georges Banks, about 100 miles east of Cape Cod. And just by chance, we had a Canadian Coast Guard aircraft in the area. He was on scene within 15 minutes, and already the boat was capsized, and Coast Guard got there a few minutes later in an aircraft that was out doing operations. This was during a major storm, so there were several things going on, and the ship had already sunk. 4 people on board. We searched for a while. We knew where it went down very clearly. We had boats out there searching, and the hard part of the job is to sit down with the family members and talk to them about it's time to stop the search. There's no way that they could be alive right now. And that's a hard, very hard decision to convince people that their loved ones, it may have been 2 or 3 days, even if they had survived the sinking, it's unlikely they did. I think they went down with the ship. We weren't able to confirm that exactly, but the Italian Gold was a 70-foot tanker, a fishing vessel, I believe, around 70 feet, experienced crew, just bad luck. Caught by, could have been a rogue wave. It looks like it may have been hit by a 40-foot wave or more and caved in the side and sank. We know some of this because we dove, there was diving done on the vessel after it sank. And the photo you see on the screen right now is the vessel sitting on the bottom out in Georges Bank. So those are the sad days. There are a lot of good days to go along with that, where you actually save somebody and bring them to shore. I am currently a volunteer, as Ann suggested, at the Coast Guard Heritage Museum. If you haven't been there, stop by. We have all sorts of stories to tell you, not just about shipwrecks, about a lot of things that have occurred within the Coast Guard, but with a focus on Cape Cod. Cape Cod and Massachusetts is the birthplace of the Coast Guard. Coast Guard is multi-dimensional. This is a modern picture of the Coast Guard. Actually, not that modern, because it shows a 44-footer there that have been all retired at this point, and the aircraft, also the helicopter, has been retired. But birthplace, meaning there are three arms of the Coast Guard: Revenue Cutter Service, the Lighthouse Service, and the Lifesaving Service, that all have origins here in Massachusetts. That's a topic for a whole other lecture I could get to. Just venture to say, all these came about in the 1700s, just after the Revolution. Actually, before the Revenue Cutter Service was the last to come in 1790, which was the second year of Washington's administration. So all of them started here in Massachusetts in some form, and then evolved into the current Coast Guard. But again, I'm going to save that for another lecture. Let me just talk about a couple people here. Boston Light, I just mentioned, and some of you are familiar with Cape Cod Light, or called Highland Light, built in 1798. The Revenue Cutter, Massachusetts was the first Revenue Cutter built commissioned in 1791 and home ported, and it was actually constructed up in Newburyport, and it was home ported in Boston with a Boston captain. The Massachusetts Humane Society, or the Humane Society of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Humane Society today refers to animals. Not back then. They were concerned about humans. In fact, the Humane Society was involved in forming Mass General Hospital, but they were very concerned about the number of people we're losing at sea, the mariners that were coming into Boston. There was for lack of a better term, a plethora of ship disasters that were occurring. So they set up huts along the shore. They set up a rescue system. It led to eventually a model for the U.S. Lifesaving Service that became the Coast Guard. Just went the wrong way, sorry. One of the heroes of the Massachusetts Humane Society, and then with the U.S. Lifesaving Service, was Joshua James out in Point Allerton, just at the entrance to Boston Harbor. He was a person that served, my calculations are correct, I think he served 60 years as a rescuer. A lot of awards, as you can imagine. A person that died on the job during a drill and just after the turn of the century. But let me get to Massachusetts and a little bit. What makes this the graveyard of the Atlantic? It's considered by many to be one of the most treacherous areas certainly off the coast of the United States. So people in North Carolina would argue that it's pretty treacherous down there too, and Sable Island south of Nova Scotia, or Newfoundland, Nova Scotia would argue that. But this is an area where there have been, by our count, in excess of 3,000 shipwrecks, probably well in excess of 3,000 shipwrecks since Europeans started to explore these coasts. The advances in modern navigation and weather forecasting, vessel technologies and improvements have reduced or maybe even eliminated some of the risk, but not all of it. And we'll see that in a second. I'll get to that in a second. There have been many tragedies. I'll mention very quickly while I have this graph up, many tragedies. One or two, again, I'm not gonna go through all 3,000 tonight, but one or two include the October 1941, when a late gale swept up the coast, came out to, I really haven't got an ability to point here, but it came up the coast and went out to Georges Bank, and the fishing fleet, much of the fishing fleet from Cape Cod was out on Georges Bank. Understand, Georges Bank is about 100 miles offshore. It's kind of southwest of where you see Newfoundland, where you see Nova Scotia on this map, and due east of Cape Cod. And during that storm, there was a loss of 14 fishing vessels and 87 men from Cape Cod, mostly from Truro and Dennis. It was devastating. These were small communities, families. Many families were left with no breadwinner. Another storm of note, and I'm trying not to get too much into all the storms. There were many, many, particularly in the 18th century. There was one that affected the Gloucester fleet, the storm of 1879, February 1879, where in 1 month, the month of February, they lost 14 vessels and 157 men passed away. 240 men during that year. It's just a bad year altogether. During a study done by the Cape Cod Canal, in preparation for the Cape Cod Canal and justifying it, there was a study first done from 1843 to 1860, identified 827 ships that were lost along Cape Cod during that period. They still kept pushing for the canal, which many of you remember it wasn't built until started construction in 1909. But the 45 years after the first study, they identified another 900 wrecks that occurred. There was public outrage about a need to do something to save mariners. In the first report of the U.S. Lifesaving Service, this was dated in the early 1870s, they said that when they talked about the dangers and justifying their existence, they said, but it is Cape Cod which most fiercely menaces commerce. Nearly every point in the seaward side of the Cape has had some shipwrecks. I think that's an understatement. Many of the points have multiple shipwrecks. So let me get to first the cause. Why do we have so many shipwrecks here? If you walk the Cape at any point, I was going to bring in a scrap of wood that I have from walks on the Cape that could have been from a boat that was shipwrecked, or it could have been from one of the houses that were washed into the Atlantic. But 300 shipwrecks, 3,000 shipwrecks that have occurred, as I said, probably many, many more than that. I say many, many more because many people left ports, like the fishing vessels and so forth, and never returned. They don't know where they went. Some of the vessels that left from Salem, for example, heading down to the Orient, may have shipwrecked off Cape Cod. Many of the transatlantic ships coming across may have hit Cape Cod. No one knew about it, and there was no one to be found. But let's specifically look at and I won't dwell on this, I'll get to pictures and talking about shipwrecks more specifically here in a second, but I want to talk about what causes shipwrecks. What are the dangers? It is an inherently hostile environment. Humans are never intended to go onto the oceans. It was, we can't breathe the water. Hypothermic, particularly up here in Cape Cod. We can swim, some of us for longer times than others, but certainly not days or months or years at a time. It's a hostile environment. It's not natural for humans to be on, but it is important for humans to be on the water. It's commerce, transporting people. There's also Mother Nature, winds, waves, I mentioned cold weather, all those things affect the survivability, if you will, of vessels in the marine environment. Navigational shortcomings, navigational problems were common. I'll go to this gentleman here. John Harrison was, in the 1700s, a watchmaker and inventor. He worked on the marine chronometer, and finally in the mid-1700s, he was able to get a chronometer that was extremely accurate. The value of the chronometer is, if you knew the time based on meridian, prime meridian in England, you could do celestial navigation, figure out longitude. You've been able to figure out latitude for quite a while, but if you're coming across the ocean, you're never quite sure when you're going to arrive at the shore. And that made a difference in navigation. But that wasn't until the mid-1700s. And not all vessels still had a chronometer, and certainly there are many, many advances since then. I'll go back to this slide one more time. Equipment failures, common. This is not just vessels breaking apart, but fires, a number of things, engines dying, sails being blown out, human error, not uncommon, other ships, running into other ships, not a good thing to do, and coastal hazards. Cape Cod particularly, a lot of coastal hazards. So let me move on to Cape Cod. Doesn't look too bad there. This is the seashore, summertime, little waves lapping in, sand, not rock. You think a vessel that came aground there would be able to take out lunch, have a picnic on the shore, and go back out a couple hours later. this is not the type of sea that causes the problems. It's the winter time when most of the tourists aren't here. Many of them live here year round. Sorry, let me go back. People live here year round, understand the sea kicking up. If a ship comes up onto the sandbar with heavy seas, it is literally a matter of hours before it's torn apart. So this is different than most people think of Cape. It's a dangerous area for mariners. The Cape Cod particularly has a lot of shoals, particularly down around Nantucket, heavy marine traffic. The early interstate highway, we think of interstate highway as what Eisenhower created back in the 1950s. But the early interstate highway is what went along our coast, carrying food, carrying lumber, carrying products from New England to the Middle Atlantic, the traffic coming across the ocean and going over to Europe and to other places internationally. There was a lot of traffic out there. Even today, there's a lot of traffic. The figure I've heard recently, and this comes from a very reliable source, that 90% of the world's product is transported by sea. I think that may have that be restated. 90% of the world's traded product, international product, is traded by sea. But a lot of traffic out there. There are 7,000 oil tankers alone on the ocean. Weather is a problem, which I'll get to here in a second on Cape Cod. There was a lack of ship-to-shore communication prior to the turn of the, until we entered the 20th century. Titanic was one that, I apologize for the spelling of response, but there was a lack of resources to respond. If you were even able to identify people on the shore to come rescue, there was no one to come rescue. So Cape Cod was unique. Again, I don't have a pointer here that will come through to you, but if you look at this, you can see an L, which meteorologically refers to a low pressure. And if those that know a little bit about meteorology understand that the wind winds around a low pressure in a counterclockwise direction. So the black arrow there shows wind. This is your typical classic nor'easter. Winds coming down from the Bay of Fundy. The things that drive the size of a wave are wind speed, which makes sense, the duration, how long the wind acts on the surface of the water, and the fetch. And the fetch is the straight part of how long the wind acts in one direction. And if you have a big low pressure out there, the wind can act on the surface of the water for hours or even days and build up these gigantic waves coming down toward Cape Cod. So you have environmental conditions with the wind. You also have, if you see this map just to the southeast of the red L, you see the continental slope going down to the abyssal plain. Up above that, the lighter blue is all continental shelf, where the depth of the water is only about 100 feet, 100 meters, I'm sorry, at most at the far end, far right side of it. Up on George's Bank, the depth of water there can be as little as 30, actually down to 20 feet in tides, maybe even lower than that. So you have, following the continental shelf, the outer ridge of the continental shelf is the Gulf Stream, or at this point called the North Atlantic Current, that follows up along that. But coming down by Nova Scotia is the Labrador Current, which is a cold current. The cold current, the warm current, the air is mixed together. The natural production is fog. And so this is an environment, particularly in winter, that has low visibility. Another thing to make shipping here and traffic difficult. So picture sailing vessels before power, just talking again 1800s particularly, when you had very heavy traffic, coming out of Boston and Salem, coming around to Cape Cod, again prior to the Cape Cod Canal, being hit by these winds. These are square riggers that are not terribly maneuverable. And if they get pushed up along the coast, there's no way to power out of it. They don't have engines to power out, so they get pushed right on shore, typically. Thus, many ships try not to get too close, but again, navigation wasn't too good back then either. So we have an environment that's prone to causing shipwrecks. And I have several I'd like to talk about tonight. It is, again, a hostile environment. The Sparrow Hawk was the first known recorded European shipwreck on the east coast of the United States. 1626, it went aground off of Orleans. It was a small vessel. It was a quarter the size of the Mayflower. It came over 40 feet long with about 25 people on board, came over from England. Not well prepared. It got most of the way here, ran out of water, ran out of beer, which was also a fluid that would keep better than water, actually. They were pretty destitute. The captain had scurvy, and came ashore in Orleans in a storm and went up on the sand. Didn't wreck the vessel. They were able to get off. The Native Americans, the indigenous people helped them off. They were able to get up to the Plymouth plantation, which had been in existence for about 6 years then. They were helped out by the Pilgrims. They got the vessel refloated, ran aground again, gave up, went to Plymouth, spent the winter there, and then eventually the next year it got down to their destination, which had been Jamestown. Believe it or not, this vessel was buried off Orleans for centuries. It finally was discovered, removed, and preserved in 1863. It was in an anaerobic environment, so there wasn't a whole lot of decay. And this is an artist's rendition of it being displayed on Boston Common, I believe. It was up in Boston for a while. The wreck still exists. It's stored up in Plymouth, and it's owned by the Plymouth Plantation, and was on display down here in the Cape in the Maritime Museum in Hyannis for a while. But it was the first. It was significant as being the first. What I find particularly interesting is that it still is very much alive, meaning the timbers are not all broken to pieces and washed away. So a 400-year-old ship. The next ship I'll mention, just in passing only because most of you have heard about it, I'm not going to spend much time on it, is Black Sam Bellamy's ship. This is an actual photograph of the ship. I say that tongue in cheek. This is the Whydah Museum over on 28. And the Whydah came down, or came up the coast from Orleans up toward Eastham and Truro, went aground, sank with a lot of riches on board, as most of you are familiar with. Only 9 of the crew survived. They probably didn't, 6 of them didn't enjoy surviving because they were eventually hung, brought to Boston on trial and hung. 3 of them were let go because they're determined to be slaves, and they didn't have any part of the pirating that Black Sam Bellamy was famous for. But it's part of our history. It's part of that navigational, the storms. No matter how much you spend at sea, you're still under the mercy of Mother Nature in many cases, or in this case, it was a major storm and they were trying to outrun people that may have wanted to get them. The next one, I'll spend a little bit of time on this one because it's significant. The HMS Somerset III was an important, it was a man of war. It was a ship of the line of the British. It was in Boston during the Bunker Hill. It was in Boston Harbor when Paul Revere rode across the harbor. And jokingly, Longfellow in one of his poems talks about Paul Revere slipping by this man of war, sort of sarcastically saying just one man slipping by the man of war to get over to Charlestown. It also participated, supported the first naval battle. This is the Battle of Chelsea Creek in Boston. But a couple years later, it found itself off Cape Cod, patrolling for French vessels coming through, providing blockades. It was devastating to the people in Cape Cod, its presence there. Blockade, many of the fish products they were doing, economically it had a disaster. The ship would come into Provincetown Harbor and go ashore and take things from everyone and resupply themselves by just taking some things from the local residents. They were hated. The British were despised on Cape Cod particularly. Well, on the 2nd of November in 1778, the Somerset, well, it was running, trying to run down some French vessels, hit a storm and ran aground on Peaksville Bar, just to the east of the center of Provincetown, and it wrecked. There were 400 plus people on board. About 20 of them lost their life. About 400 though got ashore. This was significant for Cape Codders. Cape Cod had captured this devastating vessel, this man of war, this symbol of power in Europe. They took great pride in it. They took all the soldiers, sailors from the vessel, marched them down Cape Cod. They actually, I think, rumor has it that they were actually, some of them were jailed for a short time in the old wooden jail over by the museum in Barnstable, as they were brought around and finally marched up to Boston and became prisoners of war, except for the captain, who was brought over to Provincetown, used as in an exchange program to get an American captain back. But this was a very happy event for Cape Cod residents to get this vessel and have them have part of it. It still has remains today that appear every once in a while, appear in, let me see if I can remember the dates. 1866, it was a storm that uncovered some of the remains. In 1973, the remains, again, in the same place off Peaks Hill Bar were exposed again. And then finally in 2010, it was exposed again. Some of the timbers were taken by the Park Service and for display and for research. But a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, George Price, who was the superintendent of the seashore until he retired a few years ago, had got a call on a phone in 2005 from someone that says, I'm a crew member from the Somerset. I thought, this is really a wacko person calling me. Obviously, Somerset's been gone for over 200 years now. And he went on to talk, and George became convinced, in fact, that this was a crew member from the Somerset. The Somerset 4, again, this was the Somerset 3. Somerset 4 is a new British frigate that was came over to see the site of their forefather, or whatever you call the ship, the Somerset 3. And George worked with them. He got a piece of the hull and give to them so they could display it on the ship. But it was interesting that there is a Somerset, there's a follow-on in history. But what I also found interesting is there is a international law now that says if a naval vessel comes ashore in territorial waters even, the home country of that vessel still owns it. So they asked if they could have a piece of the timber. In fact, Britain still owns these relics, even 200 years later. That's a part of their part of the international law. So that's the Somerset. Again, I could spend quite a bit more time on the Somerset. It's an intriguing story. But let me move on to 1842. Not a very significant, although 24 people were lost in this. This is a freighter coming up, a square rigger coming up, carrying iron rails along the outer coast, and went aground on Peaks Hill Bar again. Peaks Hill caught quite a few people, quite a few vessels. It was a fully rigged vessel that was aground far enough offshore. This is really typical that the crew couldn't abandon ship and get to shore. They would have died, obviously, in cold weather. They could not come in 200 or 300 yards, and they may have been a little bit further off than that. But they were close enough to shore that the people, the townspeople, could hear the crew yelling and screaming to come save them. One by one, they'd fall into the ocean and die, fall off what was the remaining of the vessel. Finally, two young men said to the others, I'll read it specifically, he says, "We can't stand this any longer. We're going to try to rescue these poor fellows if it costs us our life." So they got a small dory, started to row out there. Unfortunately, it cost them their life, or they get rolled over, but they are heroes. A hero often is thought of a person that survives. They weren't, they tried to save them, the 25 people on board. But it's a classic case of marine disasters in Cape Cod, people trying to help other people, sometimes successfully, sometimes not successfully. Now, one other vessel, well, we're still in the 1800s, but it was a significant one. And again, I could do a whole lecture on this, but I won't. By the way, this is the Somerset 4. I'm sorry, I should have put that one up. This is the modern version of the Somerset that sank back in the 1800s. And this is Peaks Hill Bar. Again, I'm falling behind my slide. This is not the Joseph bus, which was the vessel I just talked about that the two people were lost sailing out to it. But it is where the vessel went down. You can see a square rigger way out offshore trying to work their way up the coast without being blown in, and another wreck on shore here. It is a very, very dangerous area. You can tell by the turmoil out there. It's not an area you want to try to get in and survive. You can imagine people being out there on the bar, way out where the white water you can see, being aground out there and trying to get ashore. But the next vessel I want to get to is this one. It's the City of Columbus, 1884. It was a passenger vessel used for trips from from Boston to Savannah, Georgia. weekly, maybe even bi-weekly trips. It was for several years. The crew was very experienced on board. It was a reasonably large vessel, 275 feet. It had a capacity of about 200 people. On this particular day I'm going to get to, in January 1884, they had about 131 people on board, counting the crew. And they continued down. This was before the Cape Cod Canal, remember, 1884. The canal didn't come in until a couple decades after this. They worked their way down the Cape on the outside, and then their normal route was to go through Nantucket Sound, come by Barnstable, come down between Martha's Vineyard and Elizabeth Islands, and then get over into Buzzards Bay and continue down to Savannah. It's all well and good. They've done it many, many times. This particular night, they're coming through Nantucket Sound. They started to head south through Vineyard Sound, and they were, if you can see it, the track that starts up at Nubble Light, if you can see it's number 2 on this particular map, if you can see it on your computer. That's the track that they were following, and they were supposed to divert and change course to track number 3 when they got due south of the lighthouse on the Elizabeth Islands. Unfortunately, they didn't turn. The captain went to his cabin only a few feet from the pilot house, but the crew continued on, ran aground on Devil's Bridge Shoal, and all hell broke loose, shall I say. When they went aground, the captain got up there just as they were going aground. There was some indication that there was a problem. This is a classic picture of all hell breaking loose. The vessel went aground, hard aground. The captain came running up, tried to recover by backing the vessel down. That was not the right thing to do, because it just essentially backed the vessel into a little bit deeper water. Actually, if he had moved the vessel forward, he probably would have saved more lives. Within the first half hour, they lost most of the 103 people they were going to lose that night. This was at 3 o'clock in the morning. Everyone was in bed. They moved the women and children onto the deck, the main deck, to get them into lifeboats. A big wave came over and washed virtually all of them off. Of the third of the crew passengers that are on board, women and children, all of them died. In the morning, you can see up on the ridge in the back, or the bluff in the back, is Gay Head Light. The lightkeeper Pease, got up in the morning and saw the vessel up there about 7 o'clock. He also happened to be the person in charge of the Massachusetts Humane Society boat. Got the crew. They started to rescue people. Again, it had been 3+ hours that this has been going on, so people were pretty cold. Again, I'll repeat, this was January. And they rescued quite a few people. They rescued about 20 that were still alive, got them on shore. For those that aren't aware, the Gay Head population was mostly Wampanoag Native Americans, and the Massachusetts Humane Society boat crews were mostly Native Americans. They went out and saved a lot of people. About noontime, understand, this is some 10 hours, 11 hours, I guess 9 hours after the vessel had run aground and there's people in the water. The cutter Dexter, the revenue cutter Dexter, was coming back from patrol, saw them. I repeat again, this is before communications. There was no way to radio, but they were going by and saw it, came in and helped out with the rescue. There was some heroic rescues, even at that late stage. They saved, I think, 10 or 12 people from the vessel. In the end, as I said, lost over 100 people, saved 29 or so, but it got a lot of coverage in the press. This was a major event. New York Times, all the papers caught hold of it. There were a lot of awards given out. If I have a chance at the end, I'll show you actually one of the awards given out. There were 3 gold life-saving medals given out, gold and silver life-saving medals given out to the captain, or the 2 of the officers and the captain of the Dexter for their heroism. And I actually have one of them here now. I've got it on loan from Dick Bonazart, who is one of our collectors and outstanding individual, has a very deep collection. I haven't asked him where he got this particular medal, but it is the original medal that was awarded to the crew of the Dexter. I won't go on any further about this. Again, I could spend a lot of time on this particular rescue. It was extremely sad. This kind of indicates This was a crew that went out from the Wampanoag crew that went out. In fact, if you're going from the right, the second guy from the right with a hat on, the kind of round hat on there, is the great grandfather of a friend of mine, Edith Andrews, is a Wampanoag tribe. She lives over in New Bedford now, and her great grandfather worked for the Mass Humane Society, was involved in that first boat that went out, helped out with the rescue. Many donations came in from all over the world for the Native Americans and for the crew. In fact, the crew of as an example, the crew of the Dexter received, in today's dollars, $26,530. I tried to convert it from what they got in money that came to that, which they spread out among the crew and bought new bunk beds and things like that for the crew. But this was a significant event, and needless to say, a sad event. This was the Dexter. This was in a tug over in New Bedford, where they had bodies, and families had to come on board to identify the bodies. I won't dwell on that too much. Lastly, in 1898, again finishing out the 18th or 19th century, is the British ship Jason. An example again of the treachery of Cape Cod. The vessel was coming up along the coast. The Coast Guard saw it down in Orleans as it worked its way up the coast. They knew it was in trouble. The wind was blowing on shore. They thought they might be able to make up the coast. They just didn't have much room for error. In fact, had no room for error. They finally get up off of Pemmitt near Peaks Bar again, Peaks Hill Bar, and went aground. And there were, again, a crew of about 25 on board. I'm just checking my figure. A crew of 25, all but one lost. Actually, one actually got ashore. But it's again a case, they're carrying, believe it or not, 100 bales of jute from Calcutta coming into Boston. But it's a case of Mother Nature again. Experienced crew, tragic, and they didn't do anything wrong except getting caught in a storm. They just couldn't get past Cape Cod. It drove them ashore. I had a date wrong there. This one was a little bit earlier. It was 1893 with the Jason. 1898 was the Portland. I won't get to Portland. Is a whole story on its own. The Portland sank with everyone on board was lost. It was 178 people were lost. It was a major storm. In fact, the storm became known as the Portland Gale because of the loss of life on the Portland. But there were somewhere between 150 and 400 ships lost during the storm in November 1898. The Portland was 281 feet. Not designed to go out in the open ocean. You see side wheel paddle. It wasn't an open ocean vessel, but it made the run from Boston to Portland, Maine, back and forth many times, but just went out in one too many bad conditions. And these were terrible conditions and got caught. This was a perfect storm, similar to what occurred in the early 90s. Hurricane coming up, merging with a low pressure system, and built up these gigantic waves. So now we have real outrage among people. And things happen. In 1871, for example, the U.S. Lifesaving Service was created. We're going to be celebrating that at the museum next year, 150th anniversary of the start of the Lifesaving Service. And much of it dates back to its origins with the Massachusetts Humane Society. It goes back to the 18th century. But Sumner Increase Kimball was the original commandant or commissioner of the U.S. Lifesaving Service in 1871, and was still the commissioner in 1915 when it merged with the Coast Guard to become the U.S. Coast Guard when it merged with the Revenue Cutter Service. So he was the person for the Lifesaving Service for its entire existence. Again, a topic for another lecture. But there, geez, sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button here. The response was to build, I put this up quickly, this is one of the displays at the museum. This shows 13 lifeboat stations along the outer shores of Cape Cod. 9 of these stations, 9 of the 13 were built all in 1 year, and I think it was 1873 on the outer Cape. Fast construction. It reminds me of building the Empire State Building. The dedication to get vessels there, to get boats there, so they can start to save people. I won't spend any more time on this. Again, you can learn about these stations at the museum. This is Nauset Station. Sorry, it's a pretty poor picture, but they were substantial structures that went up very rapidly. They did rescues, small boats along the shore, but there were some other things done at this period too. There was some life at sea, safety of life at sea conventions that occurred, but I have to at least mention the Titanic. It wasn't exactly a Cape Cod. I'll show a Cape Cod tie here in a second. 1911, as most of you are aware, it ran aground off the Grand Banks, about 1,000 miles due east of here. It sank by hitting an iceberg. Again, most of you know the story or saw the movie. It was heading toward New York, so there's a tie there to us, but its sister ship became important locally, which I'll talk about in a second. But one of the other ties to Cape Cod is the Titanic led to many changes, including the creation of the International Ice Patrol that was formed to track icebergs coming down into the shipping lanes. And the headquarters for the International Ice Patrol for many, many years was located in Woods Hole. I spent 4 years on the International Ice Patrol tracking icebergs up off Greenland and in the area of Newfoundland and Labrador. Again, another topic, another lecture possibly. But 1,500 lives were lost, 700 were saved in round terms, and it led to several other changes. It took disasters like this, sadly, to make many of the changes. Now, this poor vessel, the Nantucket Lightship, and there had been many Nantucket Lightships. That's why I put this one as 117. So when you say, you know, the Nantucket Lightship, you kind of have to ask people which one you're talking about. But this Nantucket Lightship was out in Nantucket Sound, about 40 miles southeast of Nantucket in 1935, April 1935, when, understand, it was there to warn mariners of the shoals of Nantucket. It was there to have a light and a fog signal. But by 1935, they also had a radio beacon on board, and they set on a beacon that allowed vessels coming across the Atlantic to kind of home in on it so they could get the directions as they started to come in toward the shoals and keep south of the shoals. Well, that led to this vessel, the sister ship of the Olympic, the sister ship of the Nantucket. This was taken about 3 months before the incident I'm going to be talking about in a second. Kind of an eerie picture when I tell you what happened. This is the Olympic, again, very similar in size to the Titanic, again, a sister ship. Well, in April, this vessel came through and homed in on the radio direction finder, from what we could tell, and split the Nantucket Lightship in half, ran it over. 7 men died, 3 were survived the crash. It was tragic, certainly from the Coast Guard's perspective. These were Coast Guard men out on the Nantucket Lightship. It indicates that sometimes it is just human error that causes things to happen. Visibility wasn't good either, but this is where the Nantucket Lightship is located. You can see the red dot in the lower right-hand corner. It becomes important in a couple other cases I'll talk to in about a second. I've already gone over my limit. Let me go a little bit longer and talk to you about a couple other incidents. This is the Pendleton. I think most of you have heard about the Pendleton and maybe saw the movie Chatham, 36,500 rescue of 32 people. I'll mention here, though, one interesting fact. Bernie Weber, who was the coxswain and was a hero, clearly my definition of a hero. But Bernie and his crew were not really ecstatic about they saved 32 people. What bothered them most about this rescue is they lost one person. There were 33 people there, nothing they could do about the cook. Quite a large man, 300 plus pounds, was caught between, a rogue wave caught between the Coast Guard vessel and the boat and didn't make it. They had their hand on him for a very short period of time. They couldn't get him on shore. That bothered them. You say, you guys were heroes. And their comment back was, no, we weren't, we lost somebody. That's typical of many, excuse me, many heroes. So that's it's Andrea Doria. I don't have time to go into a lot on Andrea Doria. It's just another example on that. We have a lot of stories at the museum. One of the guys at the museum, Phil Dolan, was on a cadet cruise. This is, Andrea Doria, you may recall, is in 1956, was on a cadet cruise out of the Coast Guard Academy, and he arrived on scene. All the people had been rescued from the Andrea Doria that were going to be rescued. There were 70 people, I think, that were lost altogether on the Andrea Doria, if I recall. He got there after it, before it sank, but they're recovering debris. They actually were shooting some of the lifeboats because they had drifted free now, and they're pretty good hazards navigation, so they're trying to shoot them to get to sink. As it turns out, another one of our volunteers, we discovered years later at the museum, was later recovering the lifeboats, repairing them in Woods Hole, and then giving them back to the cruise line. They were used for many years later, so it's a little counterproductive. Part of the Coast Guard was sinking the vessels, the other part was collecting them and restoring them. But still, it was a tragic, some people say this was the most tragic shipwreck in the century. I don't think so. Titanic would have beat it out, but we're not looking for winners here. Going on, again, quickly on that, this is a very famous, in fact, I think this won a Pulitzer Prize for photographs of the Andrea Doria sinking. You can see the lifeboats down the right-hand corner. You see the prop of the water in the upper left-hand corner. Then the Argo Merchant. Argo Merchant, I'll say just briefly an Argo Merchant. It was in 1976, went aground, terrible ship. The crew wasn't qualified, didn't have any gyro compass, they had bad maps, the helmsmen weren't qualified, it wasn't ready for sea, it had inadequate charts, it ran aground, as you might suspect. It was a T2 tanker, notorious bad ships that actually the Argo Merchant was not a T2 tanker. I'll get to the T2 tanker in a second, but still bad ships. It had only been it had been about 23 years since it was first built. Saved all the crew. The important thing about the ship is there were 7.7 million gallons of fuel on board, all of which ended up in the ocean because the ship broke apart. As dumb luck would have it, Mother Nature saved the day in this case. The winds turned and shifted and were blowing out to sea. Winds out of the northwest took all this fuel and pushed it out into the North Atlantic current and was dispersed. Not that it was an environmental impact, but if the winds had been the other direction, Nantucket and most of Cape Cod would have been devastated. 7.7 million gallons. To put that in perspective, it's about half the size of the Exxon Valdez spill up in Alaska, if you recall that, and about a 20th the size of the Deepwater Horizon spill down in the Gulf of Mexico. But it was a major spill, and it would have been devastating. Some other wrecks I'll go into here. The Royal Majesty. I'm not going to spend time on this one. There's a whole story about that. It was a modern ship, great navigation tools on board. They had a failure they weren't familiar with. Their navigation failed them and they ran aground. They ran aground only 10 miles from Nantucket in Nantucket Shoal, and the shoals off Nantucket. A friend of mine, Barney Turlow, Captain Turlow out of Providence, was sent down to do the investigation. They were aground for the better part of 24 hours. He went on board the vessel, did a full investigation while they're there, came ashore. The press interviewed him, and he explained about the navigational problems and electronics that failed and so forth. No excuses for it, but they also added that as a mariner, when you're on the bridge of a ship, every once in a while you need to look out the window. Basically, 10 miles away was a lighthouse, the Schenectady Head Lighthouse on Nantucket, that they should have seen, but they didn't, and they ran aground. And then finally, for shipwrecks, there is, by the way, this is the course of the Royal Majesty. I won't go into it. If you look in the lower left-hand corner where the AR buoy is and the BA buoy, they're supposed to be up by the BA buoy, but they're by the AR buoy, and they came up and ran into all those shoals up there. This is their actual course, is that dark line to the left is their course and where they ran aground on the Rose and Crown shoals. But this is something as a mariner or as a captain of a ship you want to avoid, being up high and dry on a breakwater. You remember this 3 years ago, the Iona, the Steamship Authority vessel coming over from Nantucket, ran aground. Again, there were many factors here, low visibility a little bit, wind a little bit, but basically it was complacency. They had very, very sophisticated charting stuff on board. They should have seen this coming. The two pilots on board had done this literally hundreds of times, if not thousands of times, come up from Nantucket into Hyannis Harbor. They missed the turn. They mistook on radar two sailing vessels that looked like buoys, and the light on the end of the jetty looked like a buoy light, and they turned right into the jetty and ran aground. Fortunately, no one was killed. There were a few people injured. The vessel was refloated, and it's still in use today. But it's, again, so many things can go wrong at sea, whether it's weather, whether it's human error, whether it's another ship running into you. Coast Guard tries to learn from these experiences, and this is the track of the, if you look, the red line is the track that the Iona followed. They should have been on the white track that went into the harbor, and they ran aground where underneath where it says Hyannis Port. There you can see a breakwater coming out. Many of you maybe are mariners, but you can understand that that's one of the things you want to avoid is running up on a breakwater. It's hard. This is a vessel taking a night a picture of it. But this is the Coast Guard today, new resources, aircraft, ships. This is a ship that was a class of ship. It's called the Sentinel class. They're fast response cutters, 154 feet. I showed this one because it's the first in a class and it's named after Bernie Weber. Bernie was the coxswain of the ship that did of the boat that did the rescue in a 36-footer off of Chatham in 1952. So it has some close ties to us. Bernie was involved with the setup of our museum back 15 years ago. And then other innovations in the Coast Guard. This is a, sorry, I went the wrong way again. This is a new class of cutter we're producing, 460 feet. People understand some of our cutters you don't see are big ships. This is 460 feet. Horsepower of, believe it or not, the horsepower will be 45,000 horsepower. This is icebreaker. It's called the Polar Security Class Icebreaker, as you can see. The first one is going to be entered into service within the next year or two, and it's going to be stationed out in Seattle. They cost, this is a little embarrassing for me to say, the cost is about $1 billion each. There are 3 of them that are going to be produced. And it's designed to ensure that we have continued access to the polar regions, both the Arctic and Antarctic, and to support the country's economic, commercial, maritime, and even national defense needs. Understand the Arctic is changing all the time now. It's melting, the ice cap is melting, and other nations are getting access to those resources and those shipping routes and so forth. Anyway, that's it. I apologize for going over. Come visit us at the museum. Would love to show you around. There are many, many stories that we can tell. I'm going to switch over just for a second to show you an artifact. Stay with me just for a second. I have several of them here, but this is worth showing at least. This is the actual medal from the rescue that was presented to Lieutenant Kennedy. It's actually had his name inscribed on it. Presented to him in 1884 for his service in rescuing people off the city of Columbus. This is, I feel almost like I'm holding up a gold medal from the Olympics that someone may have, that Jesse Owens or somebody may have earned. It's one of a kind. Obviously, there's only one of them. I haven't asked Dick how he got hold of it. But he's an avid collector, and come see this sometime. I convinced Dick to maybe borrow it again to see. It's in his collection. That's my talk tonight. Thank you for listening in. Hopefully many of you stayed with me for this. And that night, I think we're signing off. Does anyone have any questions? I didn't say that. If you have questions, you can type them in quickly. I should have said that to begin with. If you have questions, and they weren't answered, stop in. I have answers to all your questions. They may not be the right answers, but I have answers. So let us know, and we'll answer them for you. I think we're done. Thank you for coming. Appreciate it.